All right, you don't have to work out very long or have an athlete in your family play any sport for very long before you learn about RICE, rest, ice, compression, and elevation, because that is your first line of defense on any injury. I keep at my studio instant ice packs. You should always travel with them, especially if you have an athlete in your family. I also have a little fridge here, so I keep cold compresses. If I overdo it, I often will wrap up a muscle group. A loose ace bandage is another thing you should always carry with you to keep that cold compress tight and secure and keep the swelling down and also eliminate a lot of the pain. But folks, rest, ice, compression, elevation, your first line defense on any injury, and you should always keep those components around, an ice pack and a loose ace bandage and those chemical ice packs for when you're traveling. Results start when you do. RobertDothard.com.